brilliant, excellent. I love it when they give me a microphone. So if you're not here to see failure, why it happens and how to benefit from it, I do recommend you stick around because it's a good talk. I am incredibly excited about failure. I love failure. So my one problem with this talk is I don't think I will have enough time to really show how excited I am. This might run the entire 45 minutes. But anyway, so let's get started here. This happens every time. Just wrote a blog post about this and told myself not to do what I just did. That was failure. Look, live demo. All right, so introduction, who am I? Why am I standing up here right now? Well, as Ben said, my name is VM Brasseur, but because we are all friends here, you can call me Vicky. That and the fact that the virtual machine jokes have gotten really old. Don't think yours is original because it's not. Here's my contact information, and I encourage you strongly to use it. My Twitter handle is at the bottom of every single slide down here. It might be a little tiny. And I did not turn off Do Not Disturb mode. You ever do that? You have your watch just suddenly tweet at you? It's kind of crappy in the middle of a talk. Yeah, so here's my contact information. Please use it. As Ben said, I do have a long and illustrious history in technology, approximately 20 years so far. Throughout that time, I've been involved in open source software in some way. Currently, I am a senior software engineering manager at Hewlett Packard Enterprise, but thanks to a very smart acquisition, within a month-ish, I don't know, you know how these things go, I will be a senior software engineering manager at USENIX. So I love the lizard, so that's really exciting. Years ago, for professional reasons into which I do not need to go, I started studying failure as a hobby, like actively studying, researching the whole 9 yards. What follows stems from that research. Throughout this presentation, I'm going to say research shows a lot. Right? So here's that research right here. This is a Zotero bibliography. It currently has 134 items in it, coming up to a grand total of approximately 3,000 pages of information. So I will show this URL at the end. What all this research has shown is that over the past many thousands of years, we don't learn anything. We just don't. Now, there are thousands of pages of research. I'm going to try and synthesize it here and cram it into about 40 minutes. Wish me luck. So there are several, thank you, Ben. He can follow directions. So there are several common themes which are found throughout history in the failure research. I am going to present those to you. We do have several factors into most failures. We have complexity, assumptions, and then organization, aka culture. Now these are the common themes of causes of failure. There are also some things which help us improve ourselves because of failure. That would be experiments and introspection. Now I will have a section for each one of these things, but like I said, there are 3,000 pages. I'm not going to be able to get through it all. So what we have here is an overview rather than a deep dive. Please keep that in mind. So hopefully there will be about 5 minutes for questions if I can avoid rambling, but I'm super excited about this stuff, so who knows? So at that time, hopefully I'll be able to address some of your specific questions. Starting though, I would like to let you know that there are certain things I am not going to cover. I am not going to give you some sort of secret serum which you can sprinkle on everything you have and make failures magically disappear. No, that doesn't happen. I am going to provide you with a framework and some ideas and some questions you can ask to not only help make failures less common, but also less difficult, so you can learn a lot more from them. So there is another limitation of this talk which I would like to mention. And that is that there is a remarkably strong Western bias to all of the research which I am able to find. All of the research I've studied was done primarily under European psychology and primarily on Western subjects. Completely unrelated studies, but still obviously applicable in this case, is that recently they have found that a lot of Western psychological theories don't necessarily apply to non-Western cultures, to the East, to Africa. So what I say is not necessarily a worldwide thing. I would love to see studies written in English which cover any of these things from a perspective other than Western culture. So if you come across any, please use that contact information, get it to me. Anyway, please keep in mind Western bias. Now, these slides are already available. They are on Internet Archive, which is where you should put all of your slides and all of your videos. So if you want these, I will show this URL again at the end during Q&A. Finally, one more thing before I get into the really good stuff, and that is save your questions for the end. I am very easily distracted, and I've got a lot to cover. And so please save them. All right, so let's get into stuff. Some of these themes, starting with complexity. The world is complex. People are complex. Projects are complex. And the complexity hiding within something as seemingly straightforward as just a chocolate chip cookie is absolutely astonishing. The chemistry behind chocolate alone confounds human beings. It's marvelous. We as humans, however, we don't seem to like complexity. Our brains can't wrap themselves around complexity, and therefore that leads us to some unfortunate tendencies, such as willful ignorance. We have a tendency to ignore complexity. La, 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 this is not happening. Everything around us is constantly changing, it's constantly evolving, yet research shows that we prefer to operate as though we're in a static environment. We start a project and we take a mental snapshot of the world, and then we operate within that. We are all familiar with this from virtual machines, right? You take a snapshot and then you do your work there so nothing changes around you. Turns out we do the same thing in our brain. So this, as you can imagine, leads to more problems as the rest of the world evolves and continues to move on without us. Research also shows that we dislike variation. We like things to be just so and stay that way, hence the snapshotting. Therefore, we prefer to work in serial rather than in parallel. We like to focus our efforts on the best option. This is what our brain prefers to do. Therefore, people who say they're really good at multitasking are full of blue mud up to their eyebrows. Their brains just can't do it. So we prefer to focus on the static now rather than the ever-changing future. Our brains just can't handle that very well. So your task, whatever you're trying to accomplish, we like to think we know what we're doing, but we don't. Because we can't possibly know everything. We like to think we can, but we can't. And part of that is that we never look for latent errors. Now, latent errors are those snakes in the grass which will bite you if you step in the wrong place. These are those unknowns. And aside from just a silly thing that a politician said once, this unknown is a legitimate psychological concept. A latent error is an overlooked near miss. They look an awful lot like successes, but they just haven't failed yet. And that's because they have not met their enabling condition. Enabling conditions are those things which trigger latent errors and turn them to the dark side. They are no longer latent, they are actual errors. And real-world example, who out there, it's relatively new, so probably all of you, who out there remembers Deepwater Horizon? Right, just about everyone in the room. So what happened there? It was when a latent error met an enabling condition. The latent error was an incorrectly followed cementing procedure. Somebody was running a cementing procedure the way they always do it. It was wrong, but whatever, nothing ever happens. We can just do this. And because it was an incorrectly performed procedure, flammable gas was escaping. And usually that's fine. Well, this happened to occur on a day when somebody was welding nearby. It's an oil rig. That happens all the time. Usually that's fine. Well, that happened to occur on a day where there was no wind. That wind, the lack of wind, was the enabling condition which triggered a latent error which had been ignored. And because of that, it killed 11 people as it sank, as it exploded. 16 more were injured. It led to the largest environmental disaster our country has ever seen because of a latent error meeting an enabling condition. Latent errors are real and they're deadly. Now, there are things you can do about latent errors. You can run a postmortem. This is a great way to look for latent errors, right? What throughout the process of our project was successful just kind of by chance? What could have gone wrong but didn't? What turned out to be a success, but we're not entirely sure why? Those are the latent errors, and you can look those up and figure them out in your postmortem. But here's the problem. We really suck at postmortems. OMG, we're terrible at these. We prefer just mentally to focus on symptoms rather than causes. And this is regardless of which postmorteming framework we use. I don't care if you're using 5 whys. Use as many whys as you want. But we just seem to avoid going for the causes. And when we do go for the causes, when we finally get there, we prefer to look for one. We want one cause. We want blame. We want to point a finger. Root cause analysis. Here's the secret, folks. World is complex. There is never one cause. And yet we look for them. We look for just one cause, and that's a problem in our postmortems. We also have selection bias. And we look at these things, when we do it, we prefer to look at the things which are easy rather than the really hard stuff. And again, our brains just don't like working that hard. So we have a tendency, therefore, to postmortem non-representative data sets because it's easier. We're so bad at postmortems, I needed 2 slides. So we also have outcome bias. How many of you here have heard of outcome bias? Okay, a few of you. So outcome bias is when you only look at certain things which have a certain outcome. Typically, it's used in the context of success. We only look at things which are successful, and we like to focus on that because, yay, success. Well, for postmortems, we make the mistake of focusing only on those things which we deem in some way failures. And we don't postmortem the things which look like successes. If we do that, if we only look at the failures and not the successes, if we only postmortem half of the picture, not all of it, then we actively ignore a ton of latent errors. We actively ignore a ton of near misses. And we actively ignore those successful outcomes, which have a very, very complex process behind them, full of near misses and latent errors, which are going to bite us in the ass later. So how do we minimize the impact of these tendencies? Well, for starters, most of us have heard of postmortems. Let's do premortems. Studies have shown that premortems really help to cause success. When you do it, you look for those latent errors. And you list them out. And you see whether there's any way to avoid them. And you come up with contingency plans. You can also plan, but plan to change the plan. We all should plan. I know that some people are like, agile, screw that. I don't need a plan. I'm just going to go. Well, you know, we should plan. Theoretically, agile is supposed to allow us to plan to change the plan, but really what we do is we work within our snapshot and we still fail because we didn't bother to define things and we're building the wrong shit, but that's neither here nor there. From time to time, we need to stop. We need to pull our heads up from our computers. We need to look at our environment. It has moved on, have we? We might need to change our approach. Now, like I said, we're going fast. High speed, low drag, 3,000 pages in 40 minutes. So assumptions, OMG. Assumptions are a major cause of failure. Nearly every single piece of research in that bibliography it points to assumptions as a frequent contributor to failure. This seems to be one of those lessons we are completely incapable of learning for some reason. Our brains just can't not assume. Research has nothing nice to say about assumptions at all. So for starters, I need a drink. Sorry. It's water, I promise. So for starters, assumptions are usually based on incorrect or invalid information, and that's because we have that snapshot. And we keep our snapshot. Sometimes we keep it for years, that snapshot. And the world has moved on without us, and we do not update our information. We then use those assumptions based on invalid information, and we use them as a basis for a set of heuristics. And that set of heuristics we therefore apply to certain tasks. Commonly, one we are all familiar with, I'm sure, is estimations. The reason why our estimations suck is because our assumptions suck and we don't bother to fix it. And therefore, we are incapable of making appropriate estimations. It's possible, We're just really bad at it because our brains don't know what to do with that sort of thing. Other popular assumptions, which we in technology do not tend to verify because we seem to be a slightly more arrogant part of the already arrogant human race. We assume we know what our users need. We don't typically verify. We assume we are building the right thing. We assume we are targeting the right market, and we typically don't verify these things. As Ben mentioned, I did used to do consulting for startups in the Bay Area. I used to do technical business consulting. The question I saw people assuming all the time they knew the answer to was, what business are we really in? And most of those companies found out the hard way that they didn't have the right answer to that question. If you ask this question, what business are we in? What do our users really need? What are we trying to accomplish? Of a set of people in the room, and if they all don't have the same answer, you've got a problem. You've got a set of assumptions, and you need to verify them and fix them. So why are our assumptions usually bad? Well, aside from that snapshot problem, they are coming from poor problem definitions. We, for some reason, never stop to ask, again, what are we doing and why? So you can't solve a problem that you can't define. And therefore, assumptions about the problem and its solution are way off base because you're kind of trying to target a fog rather than an actual target. It's impossible to fail fast, which is something that we in technology love to say we want to do. We're going to fail fast. We're going to move fast and break shit. I think that was a legitimate thing that they used to say in Facebook all the time, or some other company. Please correct me later if I'm wrong. It's impossible to do that. You can't fail fast if you don't know when you've failed, and you can't know if you've failed if you don't stop to define your problem. So as you consider each problem, you will have a series of requirements. Each of those requirements should be treated as an assumption, and therefore they need to be questioned and confirmed. And here's why: because unquestioned assumptions become fact in the minds of the hearers. Studies show this time and time again. We can empirically, anecdotally prove that here. How many of you have sat in a room and had somebody say, I think that's going to take about 2 weeks, but I need to confirm? Probably most of us have said something like that or heard it said, right? Nobody, studies show, hears anything after 2 weeks. We don't hear, but we have to confirm. And so therefore, suddenly, everybody assumes it's going to take 2 weeks, when really it's going to take 4, it's going to take 6, it's going to take 2 months. But nobody's bothered to confirm. And that's a problem. This is very, very common in cultures which are accepting of assumptions rather than questioning of assumptions. We like to assume, or we like to claim, in technology in particular, that we don't have time to verify our assumptions. Again, we got to fail fast, we got to move fast and break shit. We got to do this, got to do this. We don't have time to verify that. But we do seem to have time to work on the wrong thing for the wrong people at the wrong time, and then fail and then do it again. We've got that sort of time, but we don't have time to pause and reflect and ask, is this the right thing to do? So how do we minimize the impact of our assumption tendencies? Well, for starters, please define your problem, for love of dog. Now, I'm not talking thesis level, PhD thesis level type definitions here. I'm talking like, a paragraph. Here is our problem. Here's what we're looking to solve. And then share that so everybody knows. And I'm not just talking share it in your team, talking share it in your entire organization. So everybody knows what you're doing and everybody's on the same page. Then you get a lot better success rates. Now, you also should continue performing your pre-mortems. Beginning of a project is a great time to do a pre-mortem. When you do that, list all of your assumptions. Verify them if you can. Verify that they are an assumption. Gather your risks. Gather your what-ifs. Come up with those contingency plans. And when you do all of these things, please write them down. Please don't just put them in a video somewhere and assume somebody's going to refer back to it later. No, document this stuff. I don't care if it's in a wiki. I don't care if it's in a markdown file. I don't even care if you're really sadistic and you use Jira. But, document that somewhere. Because you need to revisit it. You need to pause again every once in a while, pull your head up from your computer and look around. and see whether the world has moved and whether your assumptions still hold true. Do you even need to assume that anymore? Or has that assumption been converted to knowledge now? You're not going to know if you don't reevaluate your assumptions at every step in the process. Now, final major factor is pretty big. Pretty much every single slide in this talk, by the way, can be a talk in and of itself. So, have me back next year. So organization, culture, I'm talking about businesses, clubs, projects, any organized group of human beings, or even disorganized. If they've all gotten together, you're an organization. Because they're comprised of organizations, or of humans, organizations are a major contributor to failure, and that's because humans are the single most common cause of failure. It's, when you get right down to it, that's it. It's us. So, Ellen Langer, she's a psychologist at Harvard. She came up with the concept of illusion of control. Now, I mentioned earlier that we are arrogant as a species. As part of our arrogance, we like to think that, well, we have this tendency to overestimate the impact our actions can have. We overestimate the things we can control, or even just the things that we can influence. We think we can do it all. Here's the fact: we can't. We have an inflated sense, therefore, of what our leaders can do, what our leadership can do, what people can do for us. We don't have that much control, and yet we like to think we do, and isn't that cute? And this brings up our good friend, latent errors, yet again. So reminder, these are the near-miss situations. These are those things that look like successes because they don't explicitly fail. Deepwater Horizon, again, that was our example. So if we look for latent errors in our pre-mortem, in our post-mortem, we actually do have a chance of controlling those. We can do something about latent errors if we take the time to look for them. What we cannot do at all, we absolutely cannot do, is control enabling conditions. I don't know about you, but I cannot make the wind blow. I don't have that power. And I also don't know what sort of factors might trigger a latent error necessarily. Would you have thought of the wind? I wouldn't have thought of the wind. So this is where the illusion of control is. We can control latent errors if we look for them, but we can never control enabling conditions. Therefore, we can never truly control the outcome of most situations. We can't. I'm sorry. We can only influence them. So the arrangement of your organization can have a dramatic effect upon its success rates and upon its reaction to failures. How many of you know about organizational silos? Okay, keep your hands up. Of the hands that are up, how many of you are currently in an organizational silo? Yeah, I know, common, aren't they? So for those of you who did not raise your hand, an organizational silo is essentially, we have a group of people here, group of people here, group of people here, and there's no cross-contamination whatsoever. It's all clean. But that also means that they don't communicate. It also means that it dilutes responsibility. You don't know who's supposed to be doing what, where, or how, because you're not talking to each other. And therefore it obscures information, such as we run postmortems in our silo over here, and we know all these latent errors that might come up, but we're not going to tell those people. Okay, and that leads to a lot more failures. Is your organization organized around processes? Do you have a team? This is the process we run. This is the process we run. And organize your teams by processes. Well, if it turns out that one of those processes is contributing to failure, then it's very likely you're not going to change it. And that's because not only do you have to change the process itself, which you could do, it can be complicated, but you can totally do that, but you also have to do a reorg of your organization just because your org is around processes. So you're not likely to do that because, OMG, that's hard. So for both of these things, the process, organization, and silos, having multidisciplinary teams can be incredibly useful, because you get a lot of people who have to cross-communicate. You have a lot of people who don't have to get stuck to a single process. And you get a diversity of ideas which can bring up latent errors. Now, the big one, how does your organization react to failures? Now, I have actually done in my time a lot of career coaching. I don't know if y'all need to do any interviews in the near future, but if you do, I recommend you put this on the list of things to ask your potential future employers during an interview. And don't just ask one person, ask each and every person you talk to, because they're all going to give you different answers, and then you can compare them, and you can get a much better sense of how that organization reacts to failures. Does it punish people? Because punishing is bad. You don't want to work for an organization that punishes failures. Punishment makes failures cost even more than the original failure. And that's because people are afraid of punishment. People are afraid of blame. And therefore, they stop reporting failures. Is that good? No, it's not. It's because in order to prevent mistakes, we have to learn from our past mistakes. And you can't do that if your mistakes are not reported. So, your unshared failures are just experience. They're not learning. Experience is something which happens to you. You don't have to do anything. I can stand here and experience the world. If I want to learn from it, I have to take action. Experience is automatic, learning is not. You can't do either, or you can experience, but you can't learn if people aren't sharing, and they're not going to share if they're afraid of punishment. Furthermore, people are afraid to try new things if they're afraid of punishing, and that's because new things might fail. And they don't want to be punished for failure. Your innovation gets stifled, and I'm not talking innovation in a, Silicon Valley disruption sort of way. No, I'm not talking about that sort of innovation. I'm talking about the common stuff that actually makes life better, like improving a process, like streamlining something, like automating stuff, like, fixing things that otherwise would be waking you up in the middle of the night on pager duty. That sort of idea gets hidden because if it doesn't work, somebody might get blamed. Worst case scenario, this level of innovation stifling can completely kill your organization. Now, some of you out there might be going, we don't really have that problem. I know, because I never hear about mistakes. I never hear about failures. Yeah. About that. If you don't hear about them, it doesn't mean that they're not happening. It just means you have a much, much bigger problem than those mistakes you're not hearing about. You have a serious cultural issue with your org. Normalisation of deviance. This is from a concept which is from Diane Vaughan. She is an American sociologist. She studied the Space Shuttle Challenger explosion. She has a book out about it. It's absolutely fascinating. This also happens to be, little nugget of information, my totally favorite cognitive bias. OMG, I love this one. For a good time, look up the Wikipedia page on cognitive biases. So, normalization of deviance. These are latent errors which are lying right out in the open. I refer to them as snakes. Think of it as a room full of snakes that you're ignoring. You just don't see them. La, la, la. They're right there. You are actively ignoring them. My favorite example of this, let's say you are a new person at a job, sysadmin, programmer, it doesn't matter. You're tailing logs. It's a great way to learn. You tail logs. Get out. So you're tailing logs. And your log file keeps coming up with this error, and you're like, WTF? So you go to a senior person, and you're like, hey, senior person, WTF? And he's like, don't worry about that. Happens all the time. We ignore it. You know what you've got right there? You are one race condition away from catastrophe. Right. That's a normalized deviance. We in tech have an unfortunate tendency to push ourselves too hard. We try doing too much in too little time. We put in long hours, typically unnecessarily. This leads to a lot of problems. Look up the research sometime on doctors and their residencies and stuff and the errors they find due to fatigue. Now, fatigue-driven errors are a problem, don't get me wrong, but the bigger problem is more insidious. And that's because when we are more fatigued, when we have more pressure and less time, we rely much more on rules of thumb and untested assumptions. And those are much less obvious than a fatigue-driven problem. Those rules of thumb and untested assumptions get codified into policies, and those can live for years, right? So we should definitely put a lot less pressure on ourselves for less failure. We have an inability and reluctance to pull the plug. Sunk cost fallacy. We have put so much time and effort into this, we just can't quit now. We're going to see it through to the end. Here's the thing, you didn't bother to define what the end is because you didn't define your problem. So you're going to continue going with your sunk cost fallacy forever, and then you're going to have a zombie project. Someday someone's going to have to cut off its head. That's how these things work, right? Another reason you can't pull the plug is because of project champions. People who are like, yay, this is the best, OMG, this is going to be so awesome. And they get this reality distortion field around them and groupthink. And people end up with a deeply held belief that it will succeed. It's blind faith, right? And despite all facts showing that it won't, they just keep going. Other times we're just too nice, and we don't want to hurt anyone's feelings, and that's due to a fact that we have a really poor training in proper communication. There are thousands of ways to tell people in an empathetic manner, I'm sorry, but your project is cut. There are good ways to do that. So what do we do about this? Organizational changes are incredibly difficult. They're hard to start, they're even harder to finish. Step one, your leaders have to lead by example. Any and or all organizational change, research has shown again and again, must come from the top. You must have support from as far up the chain as possible, otherwise it's just not going to work. And those leaders must understand that change and understand the reason behind it. They must embrace it. And the best way to do that is for them to be willing to discuss their own failures and what they learned from it. Next, develop a culture of psychological safety. A mistake isn't a mistake until somebody names it so, until somebody is pointing fingers. Before that, it's just experience. And experience is great. Again, experience is automatic, learning is not. Experience develops intuition and skill. How many of you out there are, say, senior or principal or what have you in your thing? Right. You didn't get there from your age. You got there because, man, you seen some shit, right? And it's developed an intuition in you where you're able to see an error and you're like, whoa, I know what that is. And that's because you failed in the past. So this culture of psychological safety, finally, oh, I'm so excited. Studies are starting to show, and they're coming out, scientific proof that psychologically safe environments are the most productive, the most innovative, and the most cost-effective. So we can stop being jerks. Thank you. We have science for that. No asshole rule. OMG. It's great. So we need to root out the attitude of blameworthiness. We need to replace it with one which recognizes and embraces the value of failure and of open and respectful communication. Include truth-seeking people. Yeah, this is something that we don't do. We as technologists like to build these little bubbles around ourselves. Those silos, it's not necessarily coming from the top. We just sort of merge into them. So what we need are people who question that statement which is most deadly, which is, we've always done it this way. You can have a designated project skeptic, somebody who's really good at asking questions, somebody who's really good at going, prove it, prove it, You can have those people, you can, but they tend to be assholes. So if you want to avoid that, and I do recommend that at all points, how about you include outsiders in your pre- and post-mortems? And I'm not just talking people from another team, although that could be fine. No, I'm talking legit outsiders. As technologists, bring in somebody from customer service, bring in somebody from marketing, bring in somebody from finance, people who don't know your lingo, people who are going to ask. And you have to be careful not to make them feel like idiots. Because again, we are a more arrogant particular piece of our species. Because when they ask these questions, they are showing things that you are overlooking. And their input, therefore, can be much more valuable than yours. Get a diversity of opinion, get a diversity of experience into that room, and you're more likely to have success. And finally, please make projects more survivable. How do you do that? Well, I'm going to get into that somewhat in the next section, but for starters, don't do your project at all. Surprise! If you stop and ask yourself, what are we trying to solve and why, you might find that you don't have to do it. Then don't. Don't feel obligated to start a project that doesn't make any sense to do. Another way to do it, if you're in a large organization, maybe you get funding. Work into the process that you only fund or approve the project to certain checkpoints. Those checkpoints are where you pull your head up from your computer and you look around and check your assumptions again. Only fund to a checkpoint. It's a go, no-go situation. Green, red, really easy to do, surprisingly enough. And if you bring this up with your upper management, I'm here to tell you, I'm gonna love that idea. Another thing you can do is you can just spin them off. Go a little skunk works group over here, another company, something like that. Just get it out away from these vital systems that it might otherwise damage. You know, just isolate it. So let's talk about experiments briefly. Let's talk about making failure work in your favor. We as human beings, literally, honest to God, this is not like using literally instead of figuratively, literally would not be here without failure. And that's because evolution absolutely requires it. Evolution is a constant series of works for now solutions. And your experiments should be a constant series as well. Otherwise, your business, your project, your team, yourself will not evolve. So, something we have a hard time in business, at least. In science, we're much better about this, but in business, we have a hard time accepting that experimentation means failure. So we need to mentally rewrite ourselves. So success means learning opportunity. We should be seeking truth first and then success second. If we have learned something from that experiment, yay, it's success. It means we're less likely to screw up later. Experiments themselves can be very risky at times, but think of this a lot like a financial portfolio. You balance your risk. You have high-risk experiments and low-risk experiments, and you must balance them. Don't make everything high risk. Also, like a financial portfolio, try to invest in your experiments for the long term. Don't just give it 3 months and then yank it. I see this happen a lot with community management programs. Companies will go, yay, open source, we're gonna get a community management program. They throw something in for 3 to 6 months, don't see any return on their investment, and they don't realize it takes a long time to set up relationships. It takes a long time to do a community management program properly, but they haven't given it the time. They haven't invested in their experiment. So there are some characteristics of successful experiments. Number one, make them small and survivable. Tiny, the smaller the better. Not just because small is easy, small is fast, but it also means that if it's small, the actions are very close to the outcomes. And it makes it a lot easier to determine cause and effect. Also, when you are experimenting in this way, survivable means do it in a way where you're not starting from zero. You are familiar with at least some of the variables already. Otherwise, you are much more likely to have a failure in your experiment. Expect that some of these attempts are going to fail and relish it. Yay, something has failed. That's great. And now what have we learned from that? Have those explicit success and failure criteria. Because otherwise, you don't know when you're done. You don't know one way or another whether you're done. And finally, have an exit strategy. This is something we are very poor at. Outside of my failure research covers everything. It's not just technology, it's not just business, it's everything I can get my hands on. And politics is fascinating. And something we have a problem with are not only exit strategies, but it's also just quitting to begin with. And we seem to value, as human beings, that stick-to-itiveness, right? So Maggie Thatcher in the 80s, some of you remember the 80s like me. You know, Maggie Thatcher in the 80s said, you know, this woman will not turn. George W. Bush said, you know, stay the course. Yeah, no, I can, and it didn't. And it actually was a bad idea because the situation had changed around them and they didn't stop to change, to adjust their plans. And we do that. It's not just politics. We do that all the time. So have an exit strategy, right? Change your plan and know how to get out safely. So introspection. There are a bunch of questions you can ask of yourselves and of your organizations and answer them and see whether this might help you. What are we trying to do? What is our user trying to do? What are our assumptions? Do they still hold true? Have I reevaluated them? And what are the possible latent errors? So, what does failure even look like? What are our failure conditions? What is our exit strategy? How do we pop the stack? How do we unravel? How do we get out of this situation safely? What is our post-mortem process? Do we even have one? Maybe we should. Maybe if we start with post-mortem, then we can move on to pre-mortem, and wouldn't that be cool? How does our organization view and treat failure? Let me tell you, if you don't get the answer you want on this one, there's probably not a lot you yourself can do. You can try, you can die on that hill, you can tilt that windmill, but it's going to be a lot better for you just to GTFO, because there's not a lot you can do in that situation. Same for this. Do we have a culture which provides psychological safety? If the answer is no, you might want to get out, because your life doesn't deserve this sort of abuse. Waiting for Julie to take a picture? All right, so now here are those links again. I just threw a ton of information at you. Again, this is like the 50,000-foot view of failure and my 3,000 pages of research condensed down into 40-ish minutes. Timekeeper, how much time do I have in my slot?
You have 3 minutes left for questions.
That's what I have right here. Brilliant. So here's my contact information. We have 3 minutes for Q&A. If you want these slides, they are here, and they do have my speaker notes, because otherwise, as you can see, they're pretty much useless. So, questions? Anyone? Oh, Spencer. Oh, no, please, queue up.
No, you can go.
You ne'er-do-well.
So, all this research you did,
Yes.
who screwed up the worst?
Oh, God. Who screwed up the worst? I'm going to say I screwed up the worst, but those are stories I can't share with you right this moment because those are in flight. No, who screwed up the worst? There is no worst. It is all relative, and I don't know all the data. I don't know, but they're all fascinating and they're all horrifying, and you're never going to want to get on a plane again in your life. Yes, sir. May I help you? What's your name?
My name's Zach.
Hi, Zach.
And my question is around failures and how you can turn those into learning experiences, specifically around when you have a coworker or a subordinate who has continual issues with failure, but you don't want to punish failure as a team. How do you walk that line between sub-quality work and honest mistakes that people are learning from?
Okay, how do you walk the line between honest mistakes and sub-quality work? Well, first of all, if it's sub-quality work, they are in the wrong job and they need to be reassigned. And that's fine, that's okay. It happens all the time. And that's mostly because we as managers do a craptacular job of hiring. Right? I can't put that on that person if I put them in the wrong job. They can get a mentor, you can get them coaching, you can send them to training, there's so many different ways that you can find a way to bring somebody up without pushing them down. But it's complicated. And I only have 3 minutes. I can talk to you more after the questions if you want. One statement, I don't think any of you fine people are going to do this, but if you start having a comment rather than a question, I will shut you down. Yes, sir. What's your name?
Hi, I'm Ed.
Hi, Ed.
So you mentioned a lot of the research you were going over was psychological research. I'm wondering if you also looked at engineering research, like Henry Petrosky and his Why Bridges Fall Down books.
Yes. So I have looked into engineering research. I've looked into business research. I've looked into, the thing is, psychology comes into all of it because, as I mentioned, humans are the single most popular reason for failure. And you need to do psychology for that. But yeah, those books are great. I don't think those are in the bibliography yet. I have read them. There are some things that I haven't added, but I'll get there. Yes, sir. What's your name?
Hi, my name's Indy.
Hi, Indy.
I was wondering if you had any experiences when you're talking about fail fast and criteria for failure, how that matches up with the current obsession with A/B testing. That you have an A/B test and you have one criteria, which is sales or user engagement or who clicks the button more. How do you work in those frameworks to talk about other kinds of failure?
That's a fascinating question that nobody has ever asked me, and so I don't think I'm currently prepared to answer it. I have something rumbling in my head right now, but my answer is if it's well defined enough and tightly defined enough, it's okay to just be looking for one thing, if that's all you want to learn. If you know for a fact, all I want to know is whether people prefer blue or green, that's all you need to know, then it's great. But if you don't actually know why you're doing the A/B testing, that's when the problems come in. Great shirt, by the way.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bravo.
Hello, what's your name, sir?
I'm Stephen with
Hi,
Corvo.
Hello, Stephen with Corvo.
Tell us some more ways to make failure psychologically safe. One of my favorite ways of doing it is taking advantage of the gray hair and saying, when I made that mistake, this happened.
Okay, so how you can make failure psychologically safe? It depends upon the person and their personal comfortability with failure. People have had really bad experiences with failure. Some people have had fine experiences with failure. You don't know. So because, again, this is all about people and psychology and brains, there is no silver bullet. There is no one answer for that. One thing is to be comfortable with it yourself. And Stephen's approach is to say, well, when I was your age, I did that. That is one way to do it, but people see that as talking down to them. So sometimes, depending on how you do it, it has the possibility of being seen as talking down to people. If I were to do it, it certainly would look like I were talking down to people, because I would be like, oh, honey, aren't you cute? That's probably not the best way to do it, but that's going on in my head. So yeah, you have to find a way to communicate things which works well for that person, but saying it yourself, like, here's how I failed, here's what I did, here's what I learned from it. There is a video out from Corey Quinn, who had his talk yesterday about heresy in the Church of Docker. He did a keynote at Seagull, S-E-A-G-L, just like a month ago. And his keynote was all about Corey's failures. And it was incredibly brave of him to do that. And it was also empowering for a lot of people in the audience who had never seen somebody stand on stage before and go, yo, I fucked up. And they were able to talk after that to him. He had people coming up to him the entire conference, wanting to talk to him about their failures, because they knew it was safe to do so. And it was so good for them to be able to get these things out and learn from their failures finally, because Corey stood up and said, hey, me first. I'll be the first one to say it. We're out of time and questions. I'm sorry, Ben, for going over a couple minutes.
I expect nothing less.